Hi everybody, thanks for tuning in for another installment of QWR Nature News. I am Renee, the Animal Care Coordinator here at Quag Wildlife Refuge, and today I have a really interesting topic to talk to you all about. It is actually invasive species. So I think for us at the refuge, invasive species is, and as an environmentalist, invasive species is always kind of at the forefront of our mind. This is something that we think about a lot being in the environmental field, but I was kind of curious as to what most other people kind of naturally think of when they think of invasive species. So yesterday I was practicing my whole talk, and my husband always listens to me during these talks, and I asked him, I said, what do you think of when you think of invasive species? Because I was just kind of curious as to what other people think of first, what comes to their mind when they think of invasive species. And he right away named a couple plants, and we're going to talk about plants. I think plants are one most people think of when they think of something kind of overgrowing and taking over a space. That's definitely a great example of an invasive species. But animals can be invasive species. Lots of different types of animals. Insects can be invasive. There's parasitic funguses that can be invasive. Lots of different categories. So today I want to kind of just go over a couple different ones because unfortunately there are several. But we'll go over maybe some of the ones that are affecting us most on Long Island or in New York State. I'm gonna actually just shut this light because I'm sure you viewers can see it's flickering a little. There you go. So an invasive species, the terms we're gonna use are invasive versus native mostly. Those are kind of the ways we're gonna explain it. So an invasive species is a plant or an animal, something that's been introduced to an area. Now, all plants or animals that are introduced are not necessarily invasive, but what makes it invasive is it's outcompeting native plants. And when we say native, it means that it's naturally occurring, naturally growing, or living within an area. So invasive species, the reason why they're bad is that they outcompete other native plants. I see you guys know a couple already, or animals, or whatever category they're in. They outcompete the native things in that area. So they kind of take over. So how do invasive species get here, right? Invasive species are sometimes accidentally introduced. Some of these species came over within shipments for trade and transportation. Some of them were brought over, like some will name in firewood unknowingly. There's been funguses brought on the boots of hikers when they went from one area to another. So just unknowingly bringing these and transporting these accidentally is a common way that these things get introduced. But sometimes they're actually purposefully introduced or purposely introduced. So sometimes they're introduced because they're beautiful ornamental plants and people want to have them in their backyards, or they might be a good shade plant and coverage. Maybe they introduce them. This is one that people don't always think of. Sometimes animals or plants are introduced to get rid of another one that's not wanted. So sometimes there'll be a plant that's growing and they'll introduce a species that will eat that plant to get rid of it. But sometimes what happens is then it takes over. So purposely or accidentally they're introduced. So I think to start, I want to talk about plants because I think that's what kind of comes to people's mind first when they think of invasive. So one of the plants that we have all over Long Island, super recognizable plant, is Phragmites. Weird word. You may have seen this plant and never known what it is. Phragmites. It's spelled with a PH, so a little confusing, instead of an F. So Phragmites are these tall, slender reeds with these large panicles of flowers, very wispy, billowy panicles of flowers on the top. So when they're live, they have these green stalks, kind of purple panicles. When they are dead, they're all kind of brown and tans. So I'm sure you guys have seen Phragmites on Long Island. It exists in so many different marshlands, wetland habitats, and there are actually 3 species of Phragmites in the United States. 2 of them are native to the United States. 1 is native to New York State. This is actually a relatively new finding. So just within probably, I think it might have been discovered in the 1990s, that there was actually stands of common or native Phragmites, but most of what we see is non-native. And this was introduced in the late 18th, early 19th century I believe, from Europe. And what happened is that it takes over an area and it creates what's called a monoculture. So monocultures are not good because they lack biodiversity, and biodiversity is really important for a healthy functioning ecosystem. So without that, it makes it very difficult for lots of animals, lots of other plants to survive. And these take all of the nutrients from the soil and outcompete native plants. And they do that mainly in 2 different ways. So a lot of people think that because they have these really billowy flowers and plumes, that the main way that they're actually spread is, they think, is by seed, because you think all of these seeds would just blow around and fly in the wind, and wherever they land, it would make sense that they would probably root and grow. But the seeds have relatively low viability, and that's not to say that we shouldn't move them, but it's not the main way that these plants grow. So the main way that these plants grow is actually mostly by what are called rhizomes and stolons. So rhizomes are kind of like the root system underground, and these grow these thick mats of roots, similar to other plants like bamboo. I see some of you named bamboo. I think that was my mom, because we have bamboo in our yard. Bamboo, and a plant that we have here at the refuge, Japanese knotweed, which is very similar. So they grow in underground root systems, and they can grow really far. They can grow about 30 feet per year. So quickly too, that's very quick. And they grow in these thick, dense mats, and that makes it really hard too, because that's taking up everything within all the nutrients, all the water, all the light in an area, so other plants can't compete with that. The other way that it takes over is from a stolon. So a stolon is really similar to rhizomes and root systems, but stolons run very at the top of the ground, right along the soil line. So they are actually kind of like clones of a plant, and they can grow up to 45 feet from a parent plant. So they can go for great distances and then pop up, and it's just basically the same. It's just another smaller version, and then it will grow into a full version of the plant as well. So through stolons and rhizomes, these plants are able to take up an entire area. So this is a plant that's really affecting us on Long Island. The problem with kind of regulating this plant and trying to remove it is that it exists in these habitats, like wetland habitats, that are very prone to, or it's kind of hard to control something in a wetland habitat, because you can't put in chemicals in a wetland habitat. You can't also tramp around in a wetland habitat to try to remove them either, and there's are growing underground, so it would take a lot of effort. So you don't want to destroy the wetland habitat that it's growing in by trying to remove this. So it is very difficult, and there's a lot of regulations on wetland habitats. So it's hard to remove this once it takes root. So the main way to prevent this is preventing it to spread before it even happens. So never moving this from place to place, and kind of stopping the spread. So that's the way to do this, to get rid of this, the only real way. And they're still trying to discover better ways to control it as well. All right, so again, other plants that we think of are bamboo, Japanese knotweed, very quick growing plants. But there's a lot of different types of invasive plants. A lot of quick growing ivies and weeds. You might notice in our chocolate pudding pond here at the refuge, we have a vine that's kind of all over our trees and plants. That's wisteria, and that can take over really quickly too. The vines kind of crowd out and suffocate the trees and block a lot of the light from coming into them, make it difficult for them to grow nice and big. So a lot of viney plants are invasive too, and they grow quick, really, really quickly. So not only are plants invasive, but sometimes there are funguses, right? So kind of similar to plants, fungus that, or parasitic funguses that are dangerous to plants mostly, some to animals as well. But one of them, an example, is this one right here. This is called oak wilt. And I'll hold each picture up a little closer. So oak wilt is a fungus that actually affects the plant. It makes it difficult for the plant to take up water and other nutrients. And it kind of rots the plant from within and eventually will kill the plant. So oak wilt is one that affects, like its name, oak, primarily oak trees. Another fungus that is affecting an animal, not a plant, is white nose. You might have heard of white nose syndrome on bats. And white nose syndrome is a fungus that was first discovered in Howe Caverns, New York. And it was thought to be brought on a hiker's boot over from Europe. And what it does is the fungus attaches it. You see it mostly in the nose, like its name, and it creates like a white nose on these bats in the caves. And as they're sleeping in hibernation, it actually rouses them and it affects them. And when they're rousing from their hibernation, they're using important nutrients and food that they've stored and energy that they've stored. They're using all this energy when they're awake, and then they can't make it through hibernation. So in a cave that this affects the bats, it actually has a 90% mortality rate. So it kills large quantities of bats at a time. So white nose syndrome is another fungus that's affecting animals. So insects, we're going to move on. So insects are another example of category that can have invasives in it. And one of the insects that is affecting us here on Long Island, I have some kind of pictures and examples. I'm going to bring them over to here. One of them that is affecting us is this tiny little things. There's several in here, super tiny. You wouldn't really think they have such a large impact, but they are called the southern pine beetle. There's a bigger picture of it. So only about 2 to 4 millimeters, about the size of a grain of rice. Super tiny beetle that's affecting, like its name, pine trees. So the southern pine beetle is native to the United States, but the southern United States. And they think that its territory, its area habitat is expanding because of climate change. Our winters are not quite as extreme as they used to be, so these guys are actually able to survive longer now here, or survive throughout the winter. And that is definitely expanding their populations. So these small little insects, what happens is they get in the cambium layer of the trees. So this is a piece of bark, so this is the underside of it. And they create these S tunnels through that layer in the tree, so right beneath the bark. You can see all those tunnels. And what happens is, because of these tunnel systems, and there's these throughout all of the bark on the tree, it makes it difficult for the tree to get nutrients and water up through it, and then it eventually will kill the tree. And it kills the tree in a very short period of time. I think it's only about 2 to 4 weeks of time. And this is really affecting us all over Long Island. We have some large areas that it's affecting in East Quogue and Hampton Bays. Here's a couple other pictures. So here's your beetle up close. I'm sorry it's reflecting a little. I might take it out of here. That would be better. So some evidence of it that you can see are these kind of popcorn like sap like spillages that you can see. They come out from the holes that they've bored in. Here you go. Here's a better picture right there. And then here's some more examples of that S tunneling. So they haven't really figured out a great way right now to stop the spread of these beetles, besides taking down some of the trees that they've affected, and then they'll take down some healthy trees in kind of a transect that they would follow tree to tree. So hopefully that stops it. They will die off before they can make it to the next tree. So there's not a lot that they've discovered to be done just yet. And then I have a couple other insects that affect the Asian longhorn beetle. These guys affect elm and willows and sycamore and horse chestnut. They're pretty small. You can see that's it compared to the penny. They are much larger though than the pine beetle. But what these do is as they bore through the tree, they actually cause a lot of branches to break, and then eventually the tree will die from it. And then another insect, this is called the emerald ash borer. They're called emerald ash borer. They have this green coloration, much smaller, closer to the southern pine beetle in size. Here is the holes that they've bored in the trees, and they target ash trees, which is why they're called the emerald ash borer, and they will kill native ash trees. So another insects that is affecting our plants. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask while we're moving through these animals. So now I want to actually talk about some animals that we have around Long Island, and also some animal examples that we have at the refuge that are either were introduced or found in some interesting ways. So one of the animals that's all over Long Island, a lot of people think they're really beautiful, are swans. And the mute swan is actually an invasive species here. And the problem with mute swans is and people really recognize this about swans, swans can be extremely aggressive and extremely territorial. And they'll often kill other waterfowl and other birds. They'll kill other birds' young. They'll destroy other birds' nests. So they can be really aggressive in that way. But then the other way that they're affecting a lot of animals is they exist in such large numbers in some areas that they can actually decimate all of the food in an area. They can eat so much food at a time that they leave nothing for other animals. Plus, they're getting rid of a lot of critical plants that other animals might use just even for like food, not only food, but maybe hiding spots and things like that. Nesting material, so they are eating everything too. So mute swans are not so great to have around. People love swans, but they are super territorial and aggressive, and they eat a whole lot. So they're not really great to have on Long Island. So sometimes you might hear that they were looking to kind of deter them from nesting in some areas, and that can kind of help to limit their population growth. The other one is Norway rats. So you might not recognize the name Norway rats, but these are the brown kind of woodland rats that we may be familiar with seeing. A lot of people don't realize that these guys are non-native. So sometimes with rats, they come here hidden in shipping boats or containers, and they can get here in different ways like that. That's how a lot of plants got here too. Phragmites actually got here, was brought over. They had lined some of the boats and shipped them over, and the seeds and things got here with that. So Some of the animals that we have here at the refuge, that live here at the refuge. Let's start with this guy. This is Mikey. Can everybody say hi, Mikey, at home? So Mikey, I'm going to turn her sideways so you can see why she gets her name. Let's see. It's kind of dark in here. Let me try this light one more time. Mikey is called a red-eared slider. I can't really see her red marking that well in the camera. I don't know if you guys at home can see it. But she's called a red-eared slider. She does have a stripe of red on the side of, she's a little shy. Mikey does not love coming out, as you can see. She doesn't usually, we don't handle our water turtles very often. So she's not as comfortable as some of our other animals on camera and with being handled. So we'll just keep her out for just a little while. But Mikey is called a red-eared slider. She's a very large water turtle, especially compared to our native water turtles. You might have seen Teeny, our painted turtle. She's a native species. You might have seen her on one of our nature newses. And Teeny is much, much smaller than probably about half Mikey's size. So Mikey, she's named after a Ninja Turtle, was actually raised as a pet. But people don't realize when they get red-eared sliders, you can find red-eared sliders in a lot of pet stores. Sometimes they are very small, and people buy them when they're really, really small. And they grow really large, and they live a long, long time. And so Mikey was someone's pet, but they didn't realize quite how large she grew. Fortunately, they were able to give her to the refuge. But lots of people, when they get red-eared sliders as pets, once they get really big, they put them outside in a pond. The problem is these guys are much more aggressive and territorial, and they outcompete our native species for food and for other resources. So these guys are non-native here, but they're introduced into in our waters, and they take over. And they breed pretty successfully, and they outcompete our other smaller water turtles. Mikey's being shy. She's actually usually sticking her head out, trying to bite me most of the time. So you see, I'm mostly holding her right on the back, but she's not like a snapping turtle. She can't get that head out very far. So I just have to be careful with where my hand is in front of her. You guys have any questions about Mikey? So these turtles can also live a very, very long time. So it's important, if you ever get an animal as a pet, to really research, because sometimes they get larger than you think. Sometimes they live a lot longer than you think. These guys can live 60 years or more. So they live a really, really long time with proper care. And you need to be able to take on that responsibility if you're to get a pet like this. So it's really important that you never release your pet into the wild. So these guys would take over and become invasive, but a lot of other animals wouldn't actually survive in the wild. So you release them and then they just die off too. But you might have heard of problems with Burmese pythons and reticulated pythons in Everglades. Those are mostly released as they were pets that were released. So a lot of animals taking over and outcompeting our natives. They grow larger, they're more aggressive, they're more territorial. So make sure you do your research before you get a pet, right? All right, so I'm actually going to take the camera off because I want to show you, our next two don't really like being handled, so I'm going to show you them in their tanks. So just bear with me for one moment. Anybody have any questions as we're doing this? All right, give me 1 second. I just want to swap our camera. All right, so this guy right here is what we call our mystery frog. We're not quite sure what kind of frog he is. We thought for a little while he might be a gray tree frog because he at one point had these really bright yellow markings under here, but as you can see, they're not really there anymore. And the way he changes colors is pretty amazing and kind of similar to a gray tree frog. I'm gonna go in his tank so we can take a better look. But then someone also suggested maybe he's a Cuban tree frog. I don't know. Frogs, so sometimes he's this kind of pale gray color, and sometimes he is this very dark brown. But how did he get here? So this guy came to the refuge because someone brought a house plant home from Home Depot and found him hanging out on the plant. Now, they weren't sure if he was a native frog that just kind of wandered into the plant or a tropical species that came over on that plant. So it was very good that they actually didn't just put him outside, because if he is a Cuban tree frogs will outcompete other native frogs. That's not a good look over there. And they grow much larger than native frogs. He's actually probably doubled in size since we've had him. So he's a perfect example of how some animals get here. They hide, right? They hide in produce, in ornamental plants that we bring over. So it's very important to kind of take note of where you're moving products. Maybe you're moving from a warmer climate to a colder climate. This is where this guy comes in. He's hanging out at the top of his tank. This guy hitchhiked a ride on someone's car engine from North Carolina. Does anybody know what he is? Let's see. So he is called an anole. He's not giving you a great look right now. He's being a little shy. So he's a green anole. He is missing part of his tail. He had a hard time on that ride. So he rode the whole way on the car engine. When they stopped their car, I think they were changing some of their fluids. They stopped here in New York where they made it to their destination. They were checking fluids in their engine. And as they opened it up, this guy, it was very cold. I think it was during the fall or the winter that we received him. So he was scared and cold and hanging out on that engine. And they were like, we don't know what to do with him. So luckily they didn't just put him outside. He would have never survived out there. But he lives here. He's starting to turn green right now. Oh. You can see him just slightly starting to turn green. So he is a green anole, but a lot of the time that name is confusing because he's usually brown most of the time. So both of them can camouflage very well like the frog. But green anoles are actually kind of threatened in their area because there have been a lot of, these guys are from the southern United States. There have been a lot of animals, a lot of different larger reptiles, some larger amphibians introduced to their native habitat and endangering their populations. So this guy, he wouldn't survive our winters likely in New York State. Has anyone ever heard of the Italian wall lizard though? So the Italian wall lizard is an example of a non-native lizard, like their name, they come from Italy. That's actually established a population in New York State. That's the only lizard that we can find on Long Island, the Italian wall lizard. So most others wouldn't survive our extreme winters, but the Italian wall lizard lives in a similar climate, so it was able to adapt. Fortunately, the Italian wall lizard is not an invasive species, so it would be what we would call an introduced species, because it doesn't outcompete any of our native wildlife. Does anybody have any questions? I'll give you some time. I'll show you our beetles again. Very, very tiny, right? All right. So if we don't have any questions, if you do have a question and I maybe close up the application beforehand, you're more than welcome to type it up and we will answer. But the kind of moral of our story with invasive species is be very careful when you are moving things, plants, or moving firewood from one place to another. Try to buy native. I know we've said this in a lot of other talks. Try to plant and buy native instead of planting non-native ornamentals. And the positive with that too, we've talked about this before, but the positive with that is our native wildlife evolved with our native plants. So it will, when you plant native, when you buy native, you actually benefit all of our native animals as well. Over 90% of our insects are specialized insects. So that means that they rely on a very specific plant for their food, for their nesting, kind of like the monarch butterfly, right? We've talked about the monarch a couple times. So it's important that we support those animals because a lot of native insects are important for a lot of native wildlife because they're food for so many, and they're also important pollinators. So when you support local, that's much better because you create a better native ecosystem, better functioning ecosystem in your habitat, in your area. And then also research your pets, right? Don't ever get an animal without researching how big it gets, how long it lives, and you have to be willing to take on that responsibility, right? Sometimes for 60, 70, 80 years if you're buying a turtle, right? Or some other animals. Like a snake, right? Snakes still, they might not live 60 years, but they live 30 years. So that's a big commitment. So just do your research, right? That's the main thing. Or find someone who can help you and can answer these questions properly. All right, I hope everyone enjoyed this topic and tune in. We have a really cool nature news. Kara will be teaching a beautiful walkover in our Fairy-dale habitat on Thursday. So tune in for that one. We hope you guys all enjoyed it. And thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.